They thought she was powerless, just a servant to be laughed at and discarded. But the stranger in worn boots held a card that would turn their mockery into shame. Alexander Vale walked alone through the damp streets of Chicago, with his hands deep in the pockets of a worn corduroy jacket, the kind that looked as if it had been forgotten on the rack of a thrift store for years. Its elbows frayed, its seams tired. His boots were scuffed, their soles almost smooth. His jeans faded to a color that was not quite blue anymore, and his shirt soft from too many washes. He looked like a man searching for work, or maybe a man who had given up on the idea of finding any. No watch gleamed on his wrist, no briefcase hung from his hand, no chauffeur trailed behind him, yet he was worth $10 billion. His name could sway boardrooms, his signature could launch skyscrapers, his presence could make markets tremble. Tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight he was just another face in the crowd, stripped of armor, moving through a city that did not know him, and he welcomed it. The glass doors of the Gilded Steer rose before him, tall and proud, catching the glow of street lamps and turning them into golden streaks. It was the jewel of his empire, the flagship restaurant that drew senators, celebrities, and billionaires to its polished marble floors and velvet booths. The reports on his desk spoke of flawless service, record profits, endless waiting lists, and reviews that praised every detail. But paper reports could not tell him the truth he sought. He was not here for the food or the wine. He was here for something rarer, something money could never buy: honesty. He pulled open the heavy brass handle, and the city's noise fell away, replaced by the hush of crystal glasses and murmured conversations. Chandeliers sparkled above him, their light scattering like diamonds across the mirrors and polished wood. A fire glowed in the hearth beneath a gilded frame, its warmth washing across the room. A hostess, in a sleek black dress, glanced at him, her smile tight and brittle, her eyes flicking to the jacket, the boots, the stubble. "Do you have a reservation?" she asked, her voice clipped, already knowing the answer. He shook his head. "A table for one." She tapped her tablet with a finger sharpened to a point by habit and attitude. "We're fully booked, but we have a small table near the kitchen." It was a dismissal disguised as kindness. He nodded without complaint. It was exactly what he wanted. She led him past the velvet booths filled with laughter and gold watches, past the couples sipping wine that cost more than a week's wages, until she stopped at a cramped two-top beside the swinging kitchen doors. Each time they burst open, a gust of steam and the clatter of pans spilled into the dining room. The table wobbled as he pulled back the chair. It was perfect. From here, invisible and ignored, he could watch, and watching was the only way to see the truth. He sat, folded his hands, and let the room wash over him. No one knew him, no one cared, and that was exactly what Alexander Vale had come for. The Gilded Steer glowed like a palace of glass and gold, every corner polished to a shine, every reflection sharpened to perfection. The chandeliers above, dripping with light as if they had captured stars and scattered them across the velvet booths below. The air was rich with the smell of seared beef and truffle butter, with the faint trace of cigar smoke clinging to the coats of men who had just stepped in from the cold, and with the perfume of women who carried themselves like royalty. Crystal glasses lined every table, waiting to be filled with bottles that cost more than the rent of a small apartment, and the sound of cutlery against fine china rang like music rehearsed to impress. Waiters moved with elegance, their black vests fitted perfectly, their smiles fixed in place, each one judging silently who might tip large and who could be ignored. At the center of this stage sat the city's elite, men in tailored suits, leaning back with the confidence of people who had never worried about tomorrow, women with diamonds that caught the light and threw it back in sparks of white fire, laughter floating from their lips like smoke. Conversations rose and fell about stocks and art auctions, about trips to Paris and the latest boardroom battles. Every word meant to be overheard and admired. No one glanced twice at the man near the kitchen doors, The man in the faded jacket with scuffed boots and glasses that looked too heavy for his face. To the others, he was nothing more than a stranger who had wandered in by luck or mistake, someone out of place among velvet cushions and polished silver. He sat alone at the wobbly table, half hidden by the constant swing of the kitchen doors, and if anyone noticed him at all, it was only to wrinkle a nose at the sight of him. Yet Alexander Vale sat steady, watching, listening, measuring every detail with the calm eyes of a man who built empires. The wealthy patrons at their center tables would never guess that the man they ignored could buy and sell them 10 times over, that the very building that cradled their voices and their wine belonged to him. He was the architect of their comfort, the unseen hand that had built the brand they worshipped, and yet in their eyes he was invisible, which suited him perfectly. He traced the rim of his water glass with one finger, letting the vibrations hum against the noise of the room, letting himself feel small again. This was why he came, to test the truth beneath the shine, to see who among his people carried honesty in their work, and who only bowed to wealth. Reports could not show him that, nor numbers on a page. Only nights like this, dressed as no one, seated at a table no one wanted, could peel back the mask. Around him, laughter rose, glasses clinked, fortunes were displayed in careless words, and the stage was set, gleaming bright, unaware that its true master sat quietly in worn boots, ready to see who would pass his test. The hostess led the way with her back straight and her heels clicking against the polished floor, her smile as bright as the chandeliers above, yet carrying the sharp edge of dismissal. She had judged him at a glance, his jacket worn thin, his boots dulled by years of use, his glasses heavy and unfashionable, and she had already decided he did not belong in a place like this. Guests in velvet booths and cushioned chairs turned their heads as he passed, their eyes sliding over him like water over stone, some with faint amusement, others with quiet scorn, none with kindness. He followed without protest, his shoulders relaxed, his stride steady, because this was the ritual he had chosen for himself. When the hostess stopped, her manicured hand gestured toward a cramped 2-person table squeezed beside the swinging kitchen doors, the air around it filled with bursts of heat and clatter from the cooks inside. The table wobbled when she pressed it, a flaw ignored by management, because no important guest was ever meant to sit there. "This is all we have," she said with a smile that looked more like triumph than apology, her tone as cold as the marble floor beneath them. He nodded once and pulled out the chair, the legs screeching faintly, and sat down. The doors swung open and shut behind him with a steady rhythm, each crash spilling noise and steam, each burst reminding him of the invisible line between service and spectacle. To the wealthy diners spread across the main floor, he was hidden in plain sight, tucked away in the corner where inconvenience was buried. He rested his hands on the table, rough wood beneath the shining cloth, and let the sound of laughter wash over him. He felt the old bitterness stir, the memory of being young and overlooked, dismissed before he had a chance to prove himself. The same cruelty was here now, polished with crystal glasses and gilded frames, but no different at its core. He lifted his glass of water, condensation running cool against his fingers, and took a slow sip. From this table he could see everything: the sweep of the dining room, the waiters gliding with trays balanced high, the manager smiling too wide at a cluster of men in expensive suits. Every detail of this place was visible from the worst seat in the house, every truth laid bare. The laughter at the center tables grew louder, a performance for each other, while the staff bowed and smiled with precision, careful not to falter. He was invisible here, and in that invisibility he found power. The hostess had already forgotten him, moving on to greet a couple dripping in jewelry, her posture softening, her smile now genuine. He watched her bend slightly, her voice filled with warmth she had denied him, and he knew this was exactly why he came. Reports on his desk showed profits, numbers, efficiency, but they could never show this, the quiet cruelty that decided who deserved respect and who did not. The worst table was not a punishment, Not for him. It was his window into the soul of his empire. And from here, Alexander Vale would see everything. Anna Carter moved quickly through the dining room with a tray balanced on her hand. Her uniform crisp but faded at the seams, the apron tied neatly, though the strings had begun to fray. She was 24 years old, yet her eyes carried a weight that made her seem older, a quiet exhaustion that no amount of coffee could chase away. She had worked a double shift already, and tomorrow would be the same, because her younger sister's education depended on every dollar she earned. Her shoes, the standard black non-slip kind issued to the staff, were cracked at the edges, their soles worn thin from countless hours spent on her feet, but she walked with steady steps, determined not to let discomfort show. When she reached the small table by the kitchen doors, she straightened her shoulders, fixed a gentle smile on her lips, and set down a basket of bread. "Good evening, sir. My name is Anna. I'll be taking care of you tonight," she said in a soft voice that carried more warmth than the polished smiles floating around the room. Her hands trembled slightly, but her tone was calm, professional, and without judgment. She did not glance at his jacket or his boots. She did not measure his worth by the cut of his clothes. She simply saw a guest at her table. Alexander Vale, hidden behind his glasses and thrift store disguise, studied her carefully, noticing the faint shadows beneath her eyes, the way her fingers clutched the order pad a little too tightly, and the way she still managed to treat him with dignity. It was rare, this kind of service that did not bend to appearances, and it caught his attention immediately. As she poured water into his glass, the kitchen doors banged open behind her, making the table rattle. She did not flinch, though she had likely endured the same sound hundreds of times, her movements smooth and practiced. He ordered the cheapest beer on the menu, a deliberate test, and she nodded, with the same politeness she might have given to a guest requesting the most expensive bottle of wine. "Of course, sir, I'll be right back," she said, and turned toward the bar. He watched her walk away, her shoes scraping softly against the floor, and saw the manager's sharp eyes following her. Anna returned a few minutes later with the drink, setting it down carefully, her hands steady now, her voice even as she asked if he had decided on food. He shook his head, "Not yet," and she smiled faintly before stepping back. Around them, the room glittered with crystal and laughter, but at this small corner table there was something different, something unpolished, yet more real. Alexander could feel it, the quiet strength of a young woman who carried burdens far larger than her frame, who chose to meet each guest with respect because that was the only thing she could truly control. Her eyes were tired, her shoes worn, her shifts endless, but her politeness was genuine, and to Alexander Vale, that made her unforgettable. Alexander Vale lifted the menu, its leather edges smooth beneath his hands, the gold lettering catching the soft light of the chandeliers. He turned the pages slowly, though he already knew what he wanted, because this part of the night was always the test. Across the room, laughter rose from the velvet booths, wine glasses clinked, and silver caught the firelight. But at his small table near the kitchen doors, the world felt narrower, filled only with the steady presence of Anna Carter. She stood beside him, pen ready, her tired eyes calm, her smile professional though not forced. He closed the menu and looked up at her with the same even gaze he had used in boardrooms when deciding who was honest and who was not. "I'll have the Emperor's cut," he said, his voice low but clear, "and a glass of the 98 Cheval Blanc, just one glass." For a moment her composure almost cracked. The Emperor's cut was the most expensive item on the menu, a 48-ounce steak aged for months, seared with truffle butter and foie gras, a spectacle dish rarely ordered by anyone outside of the elite. The wine by the glass alone cost more than her weekly rent. She glanced at his worn jacket, his scuffed boots, and for a heartbeat she wavered, wondering if he was making a mistake or if this was a cruel joke. From across the room, the manager, Gregory Holt, watched like a hawk, his expression tightening, waiting for her to falter. He thrived on catching weakness, on punishing mistakes, and Anna knew if she questioned the order aloud, she would give him exactly what he wanted. She steadied her breath, let her eyes meet Alexander's, and saw no sign of foolishness there. His expression was calm, his request deliberate, as if daring her to treat him as less. Her pen moved across the notepad. "An excellent choice, sir," she said softly, her voice steady now. "How would you like it prepared?" "Medium rare," he replied without hesitation. She nodded once, her face betraying none of the storm inside, and added, "And I'll bring the wine right away." With that, she turned toward the bar, her steps measured, her shoulders squared, though she could feel Gregory's gaze burning into her back. She knew he was angry. She knew he believed the man at table 32 would never be able to pay, and that any loss would fall on her shoulders. But she refused to let that fear control her. Alexander watched her go, watched the way she held herself against the weight pressing down on her, and felt something stir in him. It was not pity, but respect. The kind he reserved for people who carried themselves with dignity when no one was watching. Around him, the wealthy guests drank and boasted, unaware that the true test of the night had already begun. The emperor's cut and the rare wine were not just food and drink, they were symbols, and the young waitress had passed the first measure by treating his order with honor instead of suspicion. Anna carried the order slip to the bar with steady steps, but inside her chest, her heart beat too quickly. The moment she placed the request for the emperor's cut and the rare wine, she felt the weight of eyes on her. Gregory Holt was watching, his sharp gaze fixed from across the dining room, his smile plastered on for the wealthy patrons at table 5, while his eyes stayed cold and calculating. She tried to walk past him, but the instant she reached the narrow hallway that led toward the storeroom, he stepped forward, his polished shoes blocking her path, his body angled so no guest could see the truth of his expression. His voice dropped low, smooth as oil but sharp as a knife. "What do you think you're doing, Anna?" he asked, his lips curling as if her decision had offended him personally. She kept her eyes lowered, clutching her notepad tight against her apron, and answered carefully. "The guest ordered the emperor's cut, sir, and a glass of the 98 Cheval Blanc. I put it through." Gregory's smile widened, but his eyes hardened. "Are you insane? Did you even look at him? He looks like he wandered in off the street. Do you think he can pay for $1,000 meal? When he leaves without paying, and he will, it comes out of your paycheck, every cent." His words dripped with poison, and Anna felt her throat tighten, but she forced herself to breathe. "You know the rules," he continued, leaning closer, the faint smell of cologne mixing with coffee on his breath. "Any mistake is on you, and with your debt hanging over this place, you can't afford mistakes." At that word debt, Anna froze. It was his favorite weapon, a chain he had fastened around her neck months ago. He had discovered a minor error in inventory, a single mislogged shipment she had made after a double shift when exhaustion blurred her mind. Instead of correcting it, he had twisted it, claiming she had cost the restaurant thousands. He called it theft, then offered her a choice. Either she accepted responsibility for a fabricated $5,000 debt, or he would have her fired and blacklisted from every reputable restaurant in the city. Anna had no power to fight him. She needed this job to pay for her sister's tuition. She needed the paycheck to keep their small apartment. She needed every tip to chip away at the endless bills. So she agreed, trapped, her wages garnished, her tips counted, her every move under his thumb. Now he reminded her with relish. "Remember, every dollar adds up. That debt isn't going away. If you make me angry, I can make it worse." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Don't think about complaining either. I know about your sister. You wouldn't want her future ruined because of your foolishness." Anna's hands trembled, but she forced herself to nod, her eyes never rising to meet his. She whispered, "Yes, Mr. Holt, I understand." He stepped back, his smile snapping into place again as footsteps echoed nearby. To anyone else, he looked like a charming manager, giving polite instructions. But to Anna, he was the shadow she could never escape. The laughter from the center of the dining room rose above the clink of cutlery and the murmur of ordinary conversations. At the largest table beneath the glow of the chandelier sat a group of wealthy patrons, their suits tailored so sharply the fabric seemed to cut the air, their jewelry flashing like tiny suns each time they lifted a glass. They had arrived late, expecting the world to bend to them. And Gregory Holt had rushed forward himself to greet them, bending low with false charm, promising them the best wine, the best service, the best of everything. They had taken over the table like conquerors, their voices filling the room, their presence demanding attention even when no one wanted to give it. Anna Carter was assigned to them, her tray balanced carefully in her hands as she approached, her smile practiced but thin. She asked softly if they would like to begin with cocktails, but before she could finish her sentence, one of the men, tall and red-faced with drink, leaned back in his chair and let out a laugh that sprayed the table. "We'll start when you learn not to stutter," he said, his companions chuckling, the sound cutting sharper than broken glass. Anna kept her face still, writing down the order without comment, but inside her chest something clenched tight. Another man waved his hand impatiently, snapping his fingers as though she were a servant in his own house. "Move faster, girl. This is not a school cafeteria," he said, his gold watch gleaming under the chandelier. Anna nodded, her voice quiet as she promised to return with their drinks. She turned toward the bar, her shoes scraping softly against the polished floor, and she heard the laughter rise behind her, not with her, but at her. "Did you see her shoes?" one woman said loudly enough for the nearby tables to hear, her diamond necklace glittering against her gown. "They look like they belong in a thrift store," another voice joined in, mocking her plain ponytail, her faded apron, her tired eyes. Their words were meant to sting, and they did. But Anna kept walking, her spine straight, her hands steady, because she had learned long ago that to show pain only gave cruel people more to enjoy. Alexander Vale watched from table 32, his expression calm but his eyes sharp, catching every word, every sneer. He saw Anna pause briefly at the bar, drawing in a quiet breath before collecting the drinks, steadying herself for another round of insults. She returned with perfect balance, placing each glass before them with precision, never spilling a drop, never faltering. Yet their laughter rose again, crueler now, mocking the way she bowed her head, mocking her silence, mocking her existence as though she were invisible except when they needed amusement. The rest of the dining room glanced their way, some smiling uneasily, some pretending not to notice, none daring to intervene. It was a spark of cruelty dressed in fine clothes, laughter used like a weapon, sharp and loud. To them she was not a person, not a young woman carrying burdens heavier than her frame, not a sister fighting for another's future, but an object, a target, a nameless figure in a uniform. Yet to Alexander Vale she was becoming something else entirely, the single voice of honesty in a room filled with polished lies, the one person whose quiet dignity was worth more than the wealth glittering across that table. Anna balanced the tray of wineglasses with both hands, her arms steady though her body ached from hours of rushing between tables, her shoes whispering against the polished floor. Each glass was filled with a deep red vintage, ordered by the guests at the VIP table, and the weight of it pressed hard against her palms. She moved carefully, her eyes focused, her breathing slow, her mind repeating each step in silence. The chandeliers spilled light across the room, catching on silver cutlery and golden jewelry, and every pair of eyes at that table followed her, as though waiting for her to falter. Gregory Holt lingered near the corner, his sharp smile fixed, his gaze locked on her like a shadow waiting to pounce. As she approached, the floor shifted beneath her, a hidden flaw near table 5. A board left uneven, despite countless complaints. Her heel caught, her balance broke, and the tray lurched forward with sudden force. Time seemed to slow, the wine lifting from the crystal rims, arching through the air in a spray of red, before crashing down across the satin gown of the woman at the center of the table. Gasps filled the room, followed quickly by laughter sharp and merciless. The woman leapt to her feet with a cry, the liquid soaking her dress like blood, dripping onto her jewels, her hands flailing as though she had been struck. The men around her roared with amusement, their laughter booming, one slapping the table so hard the silver rattled. "Well done," one shouted, his words cutting through the room. "The girl thinks she's an artist, painting with wine." Another clapped mockingly, his eyes glinting with cruelty. The woman's face twisted in outrage, her voice rising, calling Anna careless, untrained, unworthy to serve in a place like this. Each word was sharpened, meant to humiliate, meant to strip her of dignity before every guest in the room. Anna froze, her cheeks burning, her hands trembling as she tried to gather the shards of spilled crystal from the floor. She whispered apologies, her voice almost lost beneath the noise. Her body bent low, as if to make herself smaller, invisible, anything to escape their cruel eyes. The laughter only grew, spreading from the VIP table outward, other patrons smirking, some shaking their heads, others pretending not to see, though their eyes lingered with judgment. Gregory stepped forward, his expression one of feigned horror, though the flicker of triumph in his eyes betrayed him. "Unacceptable," he muttered loud enough for the crowd to hear. "A mistake like this will not be overlooked." Alexander Vale watched from table 32, his glass of water untouched, his gaze steady. He saw the wine dripping from the gown, the laughter that cut like knives, the young waitress kneeling to clean the mess with shaking hands, while the world mocked her. To the others she was nothing but a clumsy servant. To Gregory she was a problem to punish, but to him she was something more, a mirror reflecting the truth he had come to uncover. In that single moment, with red wine spilling like blood across satin, the stage revealed itself for what it was, not a temple of elegance, but a theater of cruelty. The laughter was still echoing when Gregory Holt stormed across the dining room, his polished shoes striking the floor like hammers, his face flushed red with a fury he barely tried to hide. He cut through the sound of amusement with his voice, sharp and booming, each word carrying the promise of punishment. The wealthy guests leaned back in their chairs with smug satisfaction, their eyes glinting with the cruel pleasure of knowing they had started the fire and that Gregory would fan the flames higher. The woman in the soaked satin gown fanned herself dramatically with a napkin, her voice raised in complaint, insisting that she had been humiliated, demanding that someone be punished immediately. Her companions clapped the table in encouragement, calling for discipline, their laughter now replaced by the excitement of a crowd waiting for a spectacle. Anna stood frozen beside the table, her apron stained with wine, her hands still trembling from the shock of the accident. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came, her throat tight with fear, her heart beating so hard she thought the room must hear it. Gregory reached her in seconds, his body towering over her, his jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed into hard slits. "You've embarrassed this restaurant," he barked, his voice carrying across the chandelier-lit room. "You've embarrassed our most important guests. This is the final straw." The crowd grew silent, the laughter fading into a hush filled with expectation. Every eye in the restaurant turned toward the scene, waiting, eager to see her collapse under the weight of his words. The wealthy patrons at the VIP table urged him on with mocking comments, telling him to make an example of her, suggesting she be thrown out onto the street where she belonged. One man waved his hand as though brushing away a fly, declaring that such incompetence had no place in a restaurant of this caliber. Another muttered that she was probably used to spilling cheap beer in some dive bar, and that she had never been fit for fine service. Their words stung like whips, each one cutting deeper, and Anna's face burned with shame as she lowered her eyes to the ground. Gregory lifted his hand, as if the power to end her career rested in the gesture, his lips curling with cruel satisfaction. He loved moments like this, when the room waited for him to act, when he could wield authority like a weapon. when the humiliation of another became his theater. He leaned closer, his voice dropping low but still carrying enough to be heard. "You're finished here," he said, his tone dripping with certainty. "Pack your things and get out." The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and choking, and the crowd waited for her to crumble, to beg, to run. But in that heavy silence after laughter, Anna did not speak, and Alexander Vale, sitting at the worst table near the kitchen doors, leaned forward slowly, his eyes fixed not on Gregory, but on the young woman who stood trembling yet unbroken in the middle of the storm. Alexander Vale had sat in silence as the scene unfolded, his glass of water untouched, his disguise of thrift store clothes making him invisible to those who believed themselves above him. He had watched the wine splash across satin, the laughter roll through the room, the manager's fury strike down like a whip, and the cruel encouragement of wealthy voices that turned humiliation into entertainment. For a moment he let it play out, not because he enjoyed it, but because he wanted to see who in the room would show courage, who would rise to defend someone treated unjustly. No one had. The silence that followed, the laughter was heavy and expectant, filled with eyes waiting for Anna Carter to fall apart, and that was when Alexander made his choice. He pushed back his chair slowly, the legs scraping against the floor with a sound that cut through the hush. Table 32 had been his hiding place, the worst seat in the house, but now it became the stage. He stood tall, the worn corduroy jacket hanging loosely on his shoulders, the scuffed boots grounding him as firmly as marble columns. He did not look like wealth, yet he carried himself with a presence that filled the air. His eyes swept the room, steady and sharp, and when he spoke the single word, carried like a command. Enough. The laughter died instantly, as if cut off by an unseen blade. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the chandeliers seemed to dim under the weight of his voice. Every head turned toward the man who had risen from the shadowed corner, confused at first, wondering who he was, why he dared to interrupt, why he sounded like someone accustomed to being obeyed. Gregory Holt froze, his mouth open mid-accusation, his hand still raised in triumph, now suspended uselessly in the air. Anna's breath caught in her throat as she looked toward the voice, her eyes wide, her body trembling, but in that moment she felt something shift. The man who had sat quietly at her table, who had ordered the most expensive dish with the calm of certainty, was no ordinary guest. His voice did not plead, it did not falter, it commanded, and it had silenced a room that moments before had been eager for her downfall. Alexander's gaze lingered on Gregory, then moved across the faces of the wealthy patrons, his expression carved from stone. "This ends here," he said, his tone low but carrying to every corner of the restaurant. "You will not mock a woman for an accident. You will not strip someone of dignity to amuse yourselves. This house is not built for cruelty." The words struck harder than any shout, each one precise, measured, undeniable. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some lowering their eyes, some leaning back in their chairs, as if stripped of the armor their money usually provided. The room that moments before had thrived on laughter now held only silence, a silence broken only by the sound of Alexander Vale's voice, steady and commanding, reshaping the night with a single word. Alexander Vale left the corner where he had been hidden, his chair pushed back and forgotten, his steps steady as he began to walk across the dining room. The swing of the kitchen doors behind him sent out another burst of clatter and steam, but it was drowned by the hush that followed his command. His jacket, old corduroy with frayed elbows, brushed against the edge of a crystal glass as he passed a table, the faint ring of glass against fabric louder than the whispers that spread like ripples. Every head turned, every pair of eyes fixed on him, puzzled, uneasy, some curious, others offended. Who was this man in shabby clothes who dared to rise in a place built for wealth and polished appearances? He moved with the calm certainty of someone who belonged anywhere he chose, though nothing in his clothes suggested he belonged here at all. The chandeliers caught the cracked leather of his boots, and some guests smirked quietly, thinking of him as an intruder, a fool, a man who should have been ignored. Yet the weight of his presence silenced them, for his stride carried authority, the kind that could not be purchased, the kind that demanded respect even before his name was known. The laughter that had mocked Anna minutes before was gone, replaced by a nervous tension, as though the room itself sensed a reckoning. Gregory Holt stood frozen near Anna, his face still flushed, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between the diners and the stranger who approached. He tried to maintain the mask of authority, his lips twisting into a sneer as though to remind the crowd that he was in charge, but a flicker of uncertainty betrayed him. Alexander did not hurry. He let each step echo against the marble floor, his movements deliberate, his silence heavier than words. Guests shifted in their seats, following him with their eyes, whispering to each other, wondering if he was a lawyer, a critic, some eccentric patron bold enough to defy the manager. Anna stood where she had been left, her apron stained with wine, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly together as though to keep them from shaking. She looked at him, the stranger who had defended her, and felt her heart twist with confusion and hope. His clothes told her he was poor, yet his voice had silenced power. Now, as he drew nearer, his eyes steady and unyielding, she realized he carried a weight no uniform or title could disguise. The diners leaned closer to their tables, some whispering questions, some pretending indifference, but none able to look away. A woman clutched her pearls, a man frowned into his wine, another muttered about propriety. Yet all of them stared as the man in the shabby jacket moved with the quiet force of a tide that could not be stopped. He passed beneath the chandelier's glow and stopped beside Anna, the distance between him and Gregory no more than a breath. In that moment the room was his, every gaze turned, every voice hushed, the entire glittering stage waiting for what he would say next. Alexander stood beside Anna, his presence turning every eye toward him, the silence pressing close like a heavy curtain. Gregory Holt straightened his shoulders, ready to dismiss the shabby stranger. But Alexander spoke first, his voice steady, each word carrying across the dining room with the weight of authority. "Mistakes are human," he said, his tone calm but unyielding. "But dignity is not negotiable." The words cut through the air, sharper than the laughter that had filled it moments before. And the crowd shifted uneasily, no longer certain they wanted to be part of what was unfolding. He turned his gaze to the satin-drenched gown, then back to the woman who had shouted the loudest, and said, "She slipped because of the uneven board near this table, a flaw anyone could trip over. A flaw that management has chosen to ignore." Murmurs rippled through the room, patrons glancing down at the floor, some noticing the slight rise in the wood for the first time. Alexander bent slightly, his hand brushing over the board, letting it thump under his touch. The sound echoed in the silence, undeniable proof of neglect. "You call it incompetence, but I call it negligence, and it does not belong to her." Gregory's face darkened, his words dripping with venom. "You have no authority here, sir. You don't know this place, you don't know this staff." But Alexander's calm expression did not waver. He gestured toward Anna, who stood frozen, her hands still clutching the tray as though afraid to let go. "I know enough. I know she has worked this entire night without faltering, that she has shown every guest respect, even when none was shown to her, and that the first true mistake I have seen in this room was caused by a floorboard that should have been fixed months ago." The guests exchanged glances, their earlier amusement souring into discomfort, some of them whispering excuses, others looking away from Anna as though ashamed. The woman in the stained dress fumed, dabbing at the fabric with a napkin, but even her anger seemed smaller under the weight of his words. Alexander's eyes swept the table, sharp and unwavering. "What does it say about you?" he asked. "That you mocked her, laughed at her, treated her like less than human for something that could happen to any of us." A spilled glass, a broken step, a slip of the hand. We are all guilty of these, but none of that strips us of our worth. Anna's breath caught in her throat. No one had ever spoken for her in this way. Not in this place. Not under Holt's shadow. She felt the burn of tears, but she held them back, unwilling to let weakness show. Gregory sputtered, trying to regain control, but the eyes of the room were no longer on him. They were fixed on the man in the shabby jacket, whose words carried the power of truth. A truth the chandeliers could not blind, nor the marble floor disguise. Alexander Vale had defended her, and with a simple gesture toward a broken board, he had exposed the deeper cracks in the empire she served. Gregory Holt's lips twisted into a sneer as he stepped forward, his shoes striking the marble with deliberate force, his polished suit stretching across his shoulders as though even the fabric bristled with arrogance. The room, which had fallen into an uneasy silence after Alexander's defense of Anna, now pulsed with a new tension. Gregory's eyes narrowed, his voice loud enough for every corner of the restaurant to hear. A nobody comes in off the street in rags and thinks he can lecture me on how to run my house, he scoffed, his laughter sharp and ugly. The words stung the air, and some guests allowed themselves small chuckles, nervous and shallow, eager to fall back into Holt's favor. Others shifted uncomfortably, not quite sure which side would prove safer. Anna's heart dropped, her hands clutching her apron until her knuckles whitened. She knew this look in Holt's eyes, the cruel gleam he wore whenever he sensed an opportunity to crush someone beneath him. He had wielded that power against her too many times, but now he aimed it squarely at the stranger who had dared to stand for her. Holt leaned closer, his voice low but laced with venom that carried to every ear straining to hear. I should have security throw you out right now. You don't belong here. You never did. This place is for people of class, not beggars dressed like men. Alexander stood unmoving, his posture calm, his eyes steady, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corners of his lips as though Holt's fury amused him. That quiet composure only enraged the manager further, his cheeks flushing deeper, his words spilling faster. You think you can waltz in here, disrupt my dining room, embarrass my staff, embarrass me, and walk away untouched. I have built this house into what it is. I have made it shine, made it worthy of the city's elite, and I will not have some vagrant tear it down with cheap speeches. The diners leaned closer over their tables, breaths held, eyes locked on the confrontation. No clinking of glasses, no polite conversation, only the taut silence of an audience waiting for a blow to land. Some of them believed Holt was right, that the shabby stranger should be dragged out into the street. Others, though they would not admit it aloud, felt the truth in the words Alexander had spoken minutes earlier, and waited with quiet anticipation to see if he could stand against the storm. Anna's chest rose and fell quickly, her mind racing with dread. If Holt carried through his threat, this man who had defended her would be humiliated before them all, tossed aside like she had always feared being tossed aside herself. Yet she could not speak, not here, not with her own job and her sister's future hanging by a thread. So she watched, trembling, praying in silence that he would not bow. Alexander tilted his head slightly, his calmness unshaken, and in that stillness the room seemed to lean toward him. Holt's rage burned hot, but it was clear that the crowd, the chandeliers, and the very walls now waited not for the manager's verdict, but for the stranger's reply. The air held its breath, and in that moment, the balance of power shifted. Alexander let the silence stretch until it was taut as wire, the chandeliers humming faintly above, the diners frozen in anticipation. Gregory Holt stood before him, still breathing hard from his outburst, his sneer fixed like armor. Anna remained close by, her eyes wide, her heart racing so loudly she felt certain the room could hear it. Every guest leaned forward ever so slightly, waiting for the stranger in the shabby jacket to falter, to bow, to be escorted out by security. But instead, Alexander reached slowly into the inside pocket of his jacket, the movement calm and deliberate, his expression one of absolute control. From the worn fabric, he withdrew a sleek black card, its surface catching the chandelier light with a gleam that drew every eye. He held it between his fingers, letting the silence sharpen before he spoke in a voice steady and low, but carrying to the farthest booth. "I own this place." The words struck harder than a shout. A ripple of gasps moved across the room, quick and sharp, glasses clinking as hands trembled, forks resting forgotten on plates. The staff, who had been frozen mid-stride, stopped completely, their trays balanced but unmoving, their faces pale as the realization swept through them. Gregory's smirk collapsed in an instant, his jaw opening, then closing again as though his words had been stolen. His face drained of color, his hands twitching by his sides, his certainty shattered. The wealthy guests at the VIP table shrank into their seats, their mocking laughter silenced, their jeweled hands lowering to their laps as though they could hide the cruelty they had unleashed minutes before. The woman in the stained gown flushed deep red, her diamond necklace catching the light, but unable to shield her from shame. One of the men who had jeered the loudest looked away quickly, staring into his glass as though the wine might erase his voice. Another shifted uneasily, adjusting his tie, his earlier arrogance gone. Alexander set the black card down on the table beside Anna, the gesture as casual as dropping a coin, though its weight was heavier than stone. His eyes swept the room, cold and sharp, holding each face just long enough to remind them of what they had done. "You sit here beneath my roof," he said evenly, "and mock those who serve you. You cheer when dignity is stripped away, and you call it entertainment. But this house does not belong to you. It belongs to me, and I will decide what kind of place it will be." The words carried like judgment, heavy and absolute. Anna stood trembling, her breath caught in her throat, hardly able to comprehend what had just been revealed. The man she had treated with respect, despite his thrift store clothes, was not a drifter, not a guest who had stumbled in by mistake, but the very owner of the empire she worked for. She felt the sting of tears in her eyes, though this time they were not born of humiliation, but of something closer to hope. Gregory stumbled over his words, trying to form a protest, but the weight of the room had shifted entirely. The diners no longer looked at him. They looked only at Alexander Vale, the billionaire who had shed his disguise and claimed his throne in the middle of their cruelty. The black card still gleamed on the table, the weight of Alexander's words holding the room in a silence that seemed endless. Gregory Holt tried to recover, his lips twitching into a half-smile that looked more like a grimace. He cleared his throat and spread his hands as if to gather control once more, but Alexander's gaze pinned him in place. "Bring me the ledger," Alexander said, his tone low but final. The command was not shouted, yet it carried the sharpness of steel, a voice no one in the room dared to ignore. Gregory stiffened, his smirk faltering. "There's no need for theatrics," he said, his tone laced with false confidence. "Our accounts are flawless, our books perfectly kept. I will not waste time dragging out records to amuse a guest who doesn't understand how this business is run." His words tumbled too quickly, the arrogance cracking at the edges. The diners glanced at one another, their whispers returning in uneasy waves. The staff stood frozen, their eyes flicking between the manager and the man who had revealed himself as their true employer. Alexander did not move. "The ledger," he repeated, sharper this time, his patience thinning. Gregory's jaw tightened, his eyes darting toward the hallway that led to his office. He opened his mouth to argue again, but before the words could leave his throat, another voice cut across the silence, softer, trembling, but clear enough to reach every corner of the glittering room. Anna Carter stood beside them, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes wide yet steady. "He won't show you," she said, her voice quivering but firm with truth. The room stilled again, all eyes turning toward her, the waitress who only moments before had been mocked and humiliated. Her throat felt dry, but she pressed on. Because he has been stealing from payroll. He takes from our checks. He fabricates debts. He forces us to sign off on numbers that don't exist. I've seen the invoices. They don't match. They never match. Gregory whipped around, his face burning red, his voice rising in a hiss. Lies, he spat. This girl is desperate. She'd say anything to protect herself. His hand lifted, as though to wave her into silence. But Alexander's eyes narrowed, his presence halting the motion. Anna's breath shook in her chest, yet she kept going. He made me help him, she admitted, her voice breaking but still carrying through the hush. He said if I didn't, he'd ruin me, and I believed him. But it's true, he's falsifying invoices. He's been doing it for months. The ledger will prove it. Her words landed heavy, like stones thrown into still water, sending ripples through every guest and every member of staff. The wealthy patrons who had mocked her shrank further into their seats, the laughter long gone, replaced by unease. The staff looked at one another, silent recognition in their eyes, because they too had felt the bite of Gregory Holt's schemes. Alexander turned his gaze back to Gregory, calm but unyielding, the judgment already clear. Then let's see the ledger, he said. And this time no one doubted that the truth, trembling and raw, had already been spoken. The air inside the gilded steer was thick with silence, the chandeliers burning bright above the frozen crowd. Gregory Holt's face gleamed with sweat, though he tried to mask it with a sneer, his lips moving but no words finding strength. Anna stood close by, her breath trembling, her heart hammering in her chest after speaking the truth. Alexander Vale remained still, his hand resting lightly on the black card he had set on the table, his eyes calm and unyielding. Then, almost as if the moment had been waiting for a cue, the front doors of the restaurant opened wide. The sound of heavy steps echoed across the marble floor, breaking the hush with authority. 2 men in dark suits entered first, their badges flashing under the chandelier light. Behind them came 3 more, and with them, a pair of women carrying slim cases marked with the seal of federal investigation. Their presence turned the air electric, and whispers rippled across the room as recognition dawned. The FBI had arrived, and not alone. Auditors followed, their eyes sharp, their steps purposeful, the smell of inevitability clinging to them like smoke. Arthur Pendleton, Alexander's trusted chief operating officer, walked in last, his calm presence the steady anchor in the storm. His silver hair caught the light as he moved to Alexander's side. A tablet in his hand, his expression unreadable but sure. "Everything is in order," he said softly, his voice carrying enough for Holt to hear. "We have the files, the copies, the ledger." Gregory's mouth opened in protest, but the nearest agent raised a hand, silencing him before he could begin. The manager tried to laugh, the sound strained and hollow. "This is ridiculous. You cannot just barge into my restaurant. You cannot." His voice broke off as cold metal snapped around his wrists. The agents moved with speed and certainty, turning him toward the wall, his hands yanked behind his back, the polished cuffs gleaming as bright as the jewels worn by the guests, who sat now in stunned silence. Gregory shouted then, wild and desperate, his face red, spitting words about lies and betrayal, about a conspiracy against him, but the sound only deepened the shame that settled over the room. The wealthy patrons at the VIP table shrank into their seats, their earlier arrogance dissolving into pale silence. The woman in the stained gown clutched her pearls, her eyes darting away from Anna as though afraid to meet the truth she had mocked. The men who had jeered fell quiet, staring down at their plates, the taste of laughter gone bitter in their mouths. Around them, the rest of the diners shifted uneasily, no longer spectators at a show but witnesses to justice. Anna stood rooted, her body trembling, the sight of Holt being led away, almost too much to believe. The chains of fear he had wrapped around her for months broke with every step he took toward the door. Alexander did not smile, but there was a calm satisfaction in his steady gaze, the certainty of a man who had torn the mask off corruption and exposed it to the light. The laughter that once mocked Anna was gone, replaced by the heavy silence of shame. And in that silence, the reckoning was complete. The day after Gregory Holt was taken away in handcuffs, the atmosphere inside the Gilded Steer was different. The chandeliers still glowed, the tables still gleamed, and the polished silverware shone, but the weight of fear that had pressed on the staff for so long was gone. Anna Carter arrived for her shift as she always did, her uniform clean but worn, her shoes still cracked at the seams, her tired eyes expecting little more than another long night of work. Yet instead of being handed a tray, she was asked to wait in the office upstairs, the same office where Holt had once threatened her, the same office she had avoided whenever possible. Her hands shook as she stood before the door, unsure if she was walking into another trap, until Arthur Pendleton himself opened it with a kind smile and guided her in. Alexander Vale sat behind the desk, no longer in his shabby disguise, but in a tailored suit that fit his frame like armor. The transformation was startling, and for a moment Anna struggled to connect the man who had sat quietly at table 32 with the powerful figure before her. His eyes, however, were the same, steady and sharp, filled with a calm that eased her fear. He gestured for her to sit, his voice gentle, yet certain. "You've carried a weight you should never have been forced to bear," he said. "That ends today." Arthur handed her a folder, and when she opened it, her breath caught. Inside was documentation showing the fabricated debt Holt had forced upon her erased completely, every false number removed, every false claim dissolved. Alexander leaned forward, his tone firm. "You do not owe this company a cent. Not now, not ever. What Holt did was theft, and he will answer for it. You are free of him." Anna's throat tightened as tears filled her eyes, though she blinked them away quickly, not wanting to appear weak. For the first time in months, she felt chains lifting from her shoulders. Alexander slid another paper toward her, this one signed and sealed. "Your sister's education," he said. "Fully funded, from start to finish. Tuition, books, housing. She will never have to wonder if her future depends on your exhaustion. That is my promise to you." Anna's hands trembled as she held the document, her lips parting in disbelief, her heart pounding with gratitude, so fierce it left her breathless. She tried to speak, but only a whisper came out. "I don't know how to thank you." But Alexander was not finished. He rose from his chair and placed another folder on the desk. And finally, a new role: Director of Cultural Integrity and Employee Welfare. "You will oversee our staff, not as numbers in a ledger, but as people with dignity. No one in this company will ever again be humiliated or silenced the way you were. You have shown courage when it mattered most, and courage deserves responsibility." Anna stared at him, unable to believe the words, her tears finally falling. She nodded slowly, her voice trembling but true. "Yes, I'll do it." Alexander smiled, not grandly but with quiet approval. A new legacy had begun, one built not on fear, but on dignity. Weeks passed, and the storm that had shaken the Gilded Steer settled into memory. The headlines about Gregory Holt's arrest fading into background noise, while the restaurant itself thrived under new leadership. The chandeliers still spilled light across the marble floors. The velvet booths still held the city's most powerful figures, but the atmosphere was no longer heavy with fear or cruelty. The staff moved with ease, their smiles genuine, their eyes lifted rather than lowered, because they knew someone was watching over them who cared not only for profits, but for people. Anna Carter had stepped into her new role with quiet determination, learning each detail, meeting with each worker, listening to stories that had gone unheard for too long. She carried the weight of responsibility with the same steady grace she had once carried heavy trays. But now her steps were lighter, her heart no longer shadowed by debt or dread. One evening, when the dining room was quieter than usual, Alexander Vale returned to the same table where it had all begun. Table 32 sat near the kitchen doors, still wobbly, though now polished with care. A place most patrons still avoided. Yet to him, it was the truest seat in the house. Anna joined him there, no longer in a faded apron but in a simple dark dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face calm, though her eyes glistened with memory. On the table between them lay a folded napkin, white against the wood, the very one she had once used to wipe spilled wine, the same cloth that had carried her shame before the entire room. It was no longer stained, no longer a mark of failure, but a symbol of how far she had risen. Alexander reached across the table, his hand covering hers, his touch firm yet gentle. The room around them hummed with quiet conversation, but in that small corner it felt as though time had paused. He looked at her with the same steady gaze he had carried through boardrooms and storms, the gaze that had silenced cruelty and commanded respect, and he spoke softly so only she could hear. "The world has enough servants of pride," he whispered, each word deliberate, carrying the weight of truth. "What it needs are servants of truth." Anna's breath caught, her fingers tightening around his, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and resolve. She knew what he meant. She knew the path before her would not be easy, but she also knew she would never walk it alone. The napkin on the table, once a symbol of humiliation, had become a reminder that dignity could be restored, that courage could change not only one life, but many. The chandeliers above glowed brighter, the restaurant hummed with life, and at table 32 a new legacy was sealed in the clasp of two hands, not built on pride or wealth alone, but on the quiet, unshakable strength of truth. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.